There's a car that almost nobody talks about anymore, a car built in the north of England, in a city better known for wool mills and hard winters than for engineering brilliance, a car that looked like it came from the future, designed during a world war, launched into peacetime and dead before most people even knew it existed. The Jowett Javelin. If you've never heard that name, you're not alone, and that's precisely the problem. Because the story of how this car was built, what it could do, and why it vanished tells you something deeply uncomfortable about how industries really work, about how genuine brilliance gets crushed quietly, without headlines, without ceremony, without so much as an obituary in the motoring press. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. Let's go back to 1941. Britain is at war. Factories that once made family cars are now producing aircraft components and military transports. The future of civilian motoring feels almost irrelevant when cities are being bombed, and the outcome of the war is still genuinely uncertain. But inside a modest company in Bradford, Yorkshire, a company called Jowett Cars, something quiet and extraordinary is beginning to take shape. Jowett had been around since 1901. 4 decades of building tough, dependable, no-nonsense vehicles for ordinary working people. Nothing glamorous, nothing that turned heads in London showrooms. A northern company making northern cars, practical, honest machines for a practical, honest market. That was their identity, that was their lane. But in 1941, the company made one decision that would define the next decade. They brought in a young engineer named Gerald Palmer and gave him a single task: design the car we'll sell when this war is over. Simple, brief, extraordinary result. Palmer wasn't a conventional automotive designer. His background was in aeronautical engineering, a discipline that thinks about airflow, drag, balance, and weight distribution in ways that traditional car engineers of that era simply didn't. When he sat down to design the Javelin, he didn't look at what Morris or Austin or Standard were doing. He looked at physics. He asked a question that sounds almost naive but was genuinely radical for 1941. What should a family car actually be? Not what's easiest to build, not what's safest for shareholders. What should it genuinely be for the person who drives it in the real world, on real roads? That question, asked in a blacked-out factory in Bradford, with material shortages and no guarantee there'd even be a peacetime market to sell into, produced one of the most technically advanced family saloons Britain had ever attempted. And then it vanished. But before we get to the disappearance, you need to understand exactly how far ahead of its time this car really was. Because once you hear what Palmer actually built, the numbers, the decisions, the results, what came next is going to feel very, very wrong. The Javelin was officially revealed to the public in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, rationing still in place, the country still rebuilding. And into that moment, Jowett quietly dropped something that had no right to exist. Look at the shape first. Every British family car of that era looked roughly the same. Upright, boxy, high-roofed, with the aerodynamic awareness of a garden shed, the Standard Vanguard, the Morris Oxford, the Austin 040, honest machines, well built for their time. But visually and technically they belonged to the 1930s. The Javelin looked like it belonged to 1955. Palmer had studied aerodynamics with genuine seriousness. The Javelin's body was low, wide, and curved, with a drag profile that simply didn't exist in British family motoring at that price point. It wasn't a sports car, it wasn't a luxury machine, it was a family saloon built for the same everyday market as those boxy competitors, but shaped by someone who understood that air resistance costs you speed and fuel, and that there was no intelligent reason to ignore that. Under the bonnet, more surprises. The engine was a horizontally opposed flat 4, 1,486 cubic centimeters. Flat engines sit lower in the chassis. They lower the car's center of gravity. They make the handling more balanced, more predictable, more stable through corners. This was not common thinking in British family cars of 1947. This was advanced thinking, the kind you'd expect from a manufacturer with a racing department and a serious development budget, not from Bradford. And then the suspension, independent front suspension using torsion bars on a British family saloon in 1947. To place that in context, many cars being sold in Britain at that time still used beam axles at the front, a technology that traced its roots back to horse-drawn carriages. Palmer bypassed an entire generation of engineering convention and went straight to something genuinely modern. The result was a car that could reach 80 miles per hour. That returned over 30 miles per gallon. That handled corners with a composure that made its contemporaries look agricultural by comparison. And that did all of this while carrying a family of 4 in genuine comfort, with a cabin wide enough to seat 3 across the rear bench, unusual for a car of its class and price. People who drove the Javelin in 1947 said the same thing. Repeatedly, it feels like a car from the future. Not as a marketing phrase, as genuine bewilderment from drivers who had no reference point for what they were experiencing. Motoring journalists struggled to contextualize it fairly. There was nothing else in the British market to compare it against. You had to look to France or Germany, to certain continental machines built by manufacturers with far greater resources, to find cars operating at a similar technical level. And even then, the Javelin held its ground. This was a car built by fewer than 300 people in a converted factory in the north of England, on a budget that the major manufacturers would have considered barely adequate for a single development program, and it was technically superior to almost everything they put on the road. Performance in a press test is one thing. The real test, the test that silences doubt permanently, happens in competition, under real pressure, in real conditions, against rivals who have every reason to beat you. What happened next on those European roads should have made Jowett a name that every car enthusiast knows by heart. And the result is still, frankly, astonishing. 1950, the Monte Carlo Rally, one of the most grueling, most prestigious motorsport events on the continent, starting from multiple cities across Europe in the middle of January. Ice, snow, mountain passes, mechanical attrition at every stage, the kind of event that exposes every weakness in a car's engineering with merciless efficiency. A Jowett Javelin won its class outright. Not a sports car, not a stripped-out competition machine with a race-tuned engine and a reinforced shell. A production family saloon, the exact same car a Bradford schoolteacher or a Yorkshire doctor could walk into a dealership and buy, crossed Europe in winter conditions and beat machines that had no business being beaten by it. The Javelin's independent suspension, its low center of gravity, its aerodynamic stability at speed, every decision Gerald Palmer had made in that factory during wartime proved itself on those frozen roads. This was not a manufacturer's press release, not a closed-circuit demonstration. An international rally judged by results alone in front of the entire European motoring world. And Jowett wasn't finished. While the Javelin was proving itself on rally stages, the company's engineers were doing something even more audacious. They took the Javelin's mechanical underpinnings, the engine, the suspension geometry, the fundamental architecture, and built a sports car around them. They called it the Jupiter. In 1951, Jowett took the Jupiter to Le Mans, the 24-hour race, the most demanding endurance event in the world, where Ferraris and Jaguars and Talbot Lagos fought through the night at speeds that destroyed lesser machinery by dawn. The Jupiter won its class, a company from Bradford, fewer than 300 employees, resources that the major manufacturers would have considered pocket change, at Le Mans. Standing on the podium next to factory-backed teams with unlimited development budgets and decades of racing infrastructure. By any measure, 1950 and 1951 should have been the beginning of something permanent. Jowett had proven the Javelin's engineering credentials in the most public, most demanding way possible. Sales should have surged, investment should have followed, the name should have entered the permanent vocabulary of British motoring. Before we get to why that didn't happen, well, and the reason is darker than most people realize, I want to pause here and speak directly to you for a moment. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't do shallow. We go into the real story. The engineering, the industrial politics, the human cost behind the machines that history forgot. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe right now. You won't miss a single story like this one. And leave a comment below. Tell me what's hit you hardest so far. The Monte Carlo win? Le Mans? Or just the sheer fact that you'd never heard of this car before today? I read every comment, every single one. If this is giving you something, share it. Send it to someone who loves cars or loves history or simply deserves to know that this happened. Now, back to Bradford, back to 1952, because the cracks were already forming quietly, out of sight of the rally stages and the Le Mans podium. The Javelin had a problem, a serious one, and it lived right at the heart of the engine. This is where the tone of the story changes entirely. Every great engineering story has a shadow side, a place where ambition outran execution, where the vision was real but the resources to fully test it, stress it, and fix every weakness simply weren't there. For the Jowett Javelin, that shadow lived in the crankshaft. The flat-four engine that made the Javelin so technically compelling, the low center of gravity, the smooth power delivery, the compact packaging, had a fundamental weakness in its crankshaft design. Under sustained hard use, it was prone to failure, not in every car, not even in most cars, but enough cars, enough of the time, that owners began to notice, and then began to talk. In the early 1950s, word of mouth was everything. There were no consumer review platforms, no forums, no social media amplifying complaints at speed. But there were garages, there were car clubs, there were the quiet conversations between men who had bought a Javelin on the promise of its performance and found themselves stranded at the roadside with a seized engine. Jowett knew about the problem. They worked on it. They issued updates and running modifications through the production years, but small companies in the early 1950s did not have the engineering departments or the financial reserves to conduct the kind of exhaustive long-term durability testing that a Ford or a BMC absorbed as routine. They were building a revolutionary car on a working man's budget, and the crankshaft weakness was the price of that gap. The reputation suffered, slowly, steadily, the way a hairline crack damages a foundation. Invisible at first, then suddenly all at once. But here is what history tends to obscure. The crankshaft problem, serious as it was solvable. Engineers solve problems. Given time, given resources, given the breathing room to iterate, Jowett could have worked through it. It was not a death sentence. What came next was, Jowett Cars did not build their own bodies. This was not unusual for smaller British manufacturers of the era. Body production required expensive tooling, large factory space, and specialist labor that many independent car makers simply contracted out. Jowett sourced their Javelin bodies from a company called Briggs Motor Bodies, based in Doncaster. Close enough geographically, reliable enough operationally. The arrangement worked until 1953. In 1953, the Ford Motor Company acquired Briggs Motor Bodies. Ford needed the capacity for their own rapidly expanding production lines. The acquisition made perfect commercial sense from Ford's perspective. They were growing. They needed bodies. They bought the company that made them. What it meant for Jowett was catastrophic. Overnight, Jowett lost their body supplier. No bodies meant no Javelins. No Javelins meant no revenue meant no future. The company scrambled, looking for alternative suppliers, exploring every possible path that might keep production alive. There wasn't one, not at the speed the crisis demanded, not for a company of Jowett's size, without the capital reserves to bridge the gap, while a new supply arrangement was built from nothing. By 1954, Jowett Cars had ceased production entirely. 22,799 Javelins had been built across the full production run. The factory in Bradford went quiet. The workers dispersed, the drawings were filed away, and one of the most technically advanced family cars Britain had ever produced simply stopped. No dramatic announcement, no final farewell edition, no acknowledgement from the industry it had embarrassed on rally stages and endurance circuits. The kind of ending that feels almost deliberately invisible, as if everyone involved preferred it, forgotten quickly. But the man who designed it didn't disappear. And what happened to him next reveals something the official story almost never mentions. Gerald Palmer walked out of the wreckage of Jowett Cars and straight into one of the most productive periods of any British automotive engineer of his generation. He joined the British Motor Corporation, BMC, and over the following years, his work shaped some of the most respected British saloons of the 1950s. The MG Magnet, the Riley Pathfinder, the Wolseley 444, cars that sold well, earned genuine affection, and are still discussed warmly by enthusiasts today. The industry knew exactly what Palmer was worth. They hired him immediately and gave him significant programs. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail in this entire story. The man survived, the man thrived, but the machine he considered his masterpiece, the car that represented everything he had learned about aerodynamics, balance, and what a family saloon could genuinely be, was gone. Erased by a corporate transaction that had nothing to do with engineering quality and everything to do with the cold arithmetic of industrial scale. This is the part of automotive history that rarely gets examined honestly. We celebrate the cars that won, the companies that grew, the badges that survived long enough to become heritage. We build museums around the victors. But the Javelin story forces you to look at the other side of that ledger, at what the industry quietly discarded every time a small, innovative company ran out of road. And Jowett was not alone. The 1950s were a decade of systematic consolidation across British manufacturing, smaller companies absorbed by larger ones, independent engineering voices silenced by the logic of scale. The rich diversity of British motoring gradually compressed into fewer badges, fewer ideas, fewer risks taken. Jowett was simply one of the earliest and most complete casualties, gone before the consolidation wave even fully arrived, taken out not by a competitor's superior product, but by a supply chain decision made in a boardroom that had no particular interest in whether the Javelin survived. 22,799 cars, that is the entire Javelin production run. Ford was building more than that in a single week during the same period. Jowett's complete legacy, everything produced across the full Javelin years, amounted to less than a fortnight's output from the company that ended them. There is something in that number that deserves to be felt, not just noted. But here is where this story refuses to end on pure tragedy. Because the Javelin's disappearance did not erase what it proved. The car was gone. The ideas were not. And the distance between those two facts is where the real legacy lives. Independent front suspension became standard across the British family car market through the 1950s and into the 60s. Aerodynamic thinking, the serious, physics-based approach Palmer had applied to the Javelin, gradually became non-negotiable for any manufacturer serious about efficiency and high-speed stability. The flat engine layout found champions in companies that understood exactly why Palmer had chosen that architecture in Bradford during wartime blackouts. None of them cited Jowett. That is not how industrial knowledge moves. Engineers change companies. Ideas enter general practice. What was radical in 1947 becomes assumed wisdom by 1962. And assumed wisdom doesn't carry footnotes or acknowledgements. Palmer himself is the clearest proof of this process. Everything he'd learned building the Javelin went with him to BMC. His understanding of suspension geometry, weight distribution, the relationship between a car's shape and its real-world behavior, all of it transferred. The knowledge survived the company. The company did not survive the industry. And that gap between what survives and what gets credited is the part of this story that matters most for anyone watching today. Here is the question this story ultimately forces you to ask, not just about the Javelin, but about how you look at progress itself. When a genuinely advanced idea arrives before the world is ready to protect it, when the industrial forces surrounding it are indifferent, and the company behind it has no reserves left to fight, does that idea disappear, or does it find another way through? With the Javelin, the answer is both. The car disappeared completely. No revival, no relaunch, no later manufacturer buying the rights and continuing the line. Jowett Cars ended in 1954 and stayed ended. The Javelin became what forgotten machines eventually become, a collector's piece, a conversation at classic car gatherings, a name that produces recognition in the eyes of genuine enthusiasts and a blank look from almost everyone else. But the ideas inside the car did not disappear. They couldn't. The Javelin had already proven them, publicly, on record, in conditions that other engineers could study and build upon. Palmer's thinking entered the bloodstream of the industry and moved forward without attribution. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Today there is still a community that refuses to let this history fade entirely. The Jowett Car Club, founded in 1923, still active, keeps these cars maintained, documented, and on the road. They are not simply restoring curiosities, they are preserving evidence of what was possible, what was achieved, and what was erased in a transaction that took less time to complete than it took Palmer to design the car in the first place. If you ever get the chance to see a Javelin in person, at a classic car show, at a club gathering, parked quietly beside machines that history remembers more generously, well, look at it carefully, look at the shape, look at how low it sits, think about what year it came from and what it was surrounded by. Then ask yourself how different the story might have been if Briggs motor bodies had never been acquired, if Jowett had found a way to solve the crankshaft problem before the reputation damage set in. If one boardroom decision in 1953 had gone differently. The Javelin didn't fail because it was behind the times, it failed because the times weren't structured to protect what it represented. That distinction matters, because it means the loss wasn't inevitable, it was a choice, made by people who probably never thought twice about it. Knowing that changes how you look at the cars that won. And it makes you wonder, seriously, how many other brilliant machines were quietly erased before the world understood what it was losing. That's the real story of the Jowett Javelin, and it deserved to be told. If this video gave you something, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly these stories, the overlooked, the misunderstood, the brilliant machines that history forgot to protect. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below. What hit you hardest in this story? The Le Mans victory, the Ford acquisition, the fact that Palmer thrived while the Javelin vanished? Tell me. And if someone in your life loves cars or loves history, share this with them. These stories deserve more than silence.